I want to welcome everybody to the next video, which today we will discuss what is called the synoptic problem. And make sure that you have your notes before we begin the lesson for today. And as we talk about the synoptic problem, I'm going to ask you a question, and you answer by talking to yourself while watching the video. And that is, how many Gospels are there in the New Testament? And if you're thinking to yourself, you're trying to count them up, you should come up with the answer that there are 4. We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and we also have the Gospel of John. Now, when we talk about the synoptic problem, and we're talking about the similarities, we're going to talk about the differences. When we talk about the synoptic Gospels, we are talking about these 3 right here. John is not included in the discussion of the synoptic Gospels. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is. And so there may be some questions that you are going to ask, and these are in your notes, and let's just kind of go through them. So why do we have 3 Gospels that really come from the same perspective? Why do we have 4 Gospels if we include John in them? So why do we have 4 Gospels? Why do we need to have 4 stories about the life and the ministry of Jesus Christ? And do they have a lot of things in common? Do they have some things that make them different? The reason that we have to have 4 Gospels? Who was first? Is there a specific order? And we'll be talking a little bit about that in this discussion, and also when we talk about the Gospels, each of the Gospels themselves. But let's say we'll talk about why we have 4 Gospels. And if you think about a movie, my girls love the movie Frozen. And if you've seen the movie, you're probably starting to think about the song, in your head right now. You're going to start singing it. I know you are, because I got it in my mind right now too. Is if we watch that movie and I ask different people in class, if we were sitting in class together and I said, okay, we're going to watch this movie, and I want you to tell me all of the action scenes, and when there's an action going on, what do you see? Or maybe ask the ladies, you tell me what you see when we watch the scene of the party at the beginning, or guys, what do you see? Everybody might see something a little bit different, and that's kind of the way it is with these Gospels. And so in this chart right here, which you is in your notes, you should fill in, is we see here both the differences and the similarities with the other Gospels. And really, a couple things stand out. Let me get my pen here. Is first of all, the Gospel of Mark. Mark has 93% of the material that is in Mark is also in Matthew and is also in Luke. There's only a 7% difference of things that are only unique to Mark. Now, on the other hand, let me change a pen color here. On the other hand, Matthew and Luke have about the same similarities to differences, and then again you have 42% to 41%, so they are about the same. So 42% of what is in Matthew is only in Matthew. 59% of Luke is only in Luke. Now, what you see, let me get down here. I'm going to pick a different color. Is we get to John, The reason John's not included in the synoptic discussion is because 92% of what is in John is only in John. There's a lot of the stories, a lot of the characteristics, and when we get to talk about the Gospel of John, we will talk about that. But it's very unique. You can read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and you could read the Gospel accounts, and there are some differences in the order, and we'll talk about why. But you can read those and say, oh, there's that story. We can go over to Mark, and we can maybe read that story. We can go to Luke, and we can read that story. Kind of see some of the differences and similarities. When you get to John, a lot of that's not going to be in the other Gospels. And so that makes it very unique. If we come back up here to Mark for a moment, out of Mark, only around 50 verses, this 7% represents 50 verses. I'm getting better with my pen writing here. Let me make that an E. That looks like a C. 50 verses are only unique out of the entire Gospel of Mark. And so this is what we're going to be talking about here of why the Synoptic Gospels. So let's take a different look at the Gospels. And so we're going to talk about Matthew, Mark, and Luke as the Synoptic Gospels, and then John. What are some of the differences? Well, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they focus on the public ministry of Jesus, things he did out in public. John, on the other hand, really records private conversations. He records Jesus talking to the woman at the well, Jesus talking to Nicodemus. He records these private conversations that were not in the public eye. Now, there are some, but very few of them. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, what Jesus did in public, healing people, the preaching the Sermon on the Mount, the feeding the 5,000, that's public. John has the feeding the 5,000, that's public, but a lot of his is private. Also the region. Matthew, Mark, and Luke focus on the Galilean ministry. Jesus' ministry up north. John focuses on his Judean ministry, southern. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they have the parables. The parable of the sower, the parable of the lost coin, parable of the lost sheep, parable of the prodigal son. John, no parables. There are no parables in the Gospel of John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke really focus on Jesus' human side. They focus on his what he does with the interaction of people. John's focused on Jesus' divine side, his divinity. John starts out in John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Talking about Jesus' divine side. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they focus on Jesus' again, kind of going along with his human side, his earthly aspect. But John is focused on Jesus' heavenly aspect. And so what we're going to do today in this video is we're going to talk about some major theories behind the Synoptic Gospels and different views on who is first, who is last, did anybody use any of the other ones? And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. And I'm going to give you, we're going to talk about 5 major theories. And we're going to kind of go kind of quickly. But we're going to focus in mainly on this last one right here, the document hypotheses, which is also called the Marcan priority. And so I'm going to kind of go through these in your notes. You can just follow along and fill in the information as we go through. The first one is what's called the two gospel hypothesis. And the major premise is this. Matthew has the priority. That means that Matthew was first. The two gospel hypothesis puts that Mark is posterior. That means that Mark was last. And then Mark uses both Matthew and Luke, which would give us one of the reasons why Mark has so much in common with the other ones. Now, if we're going to draw this out, and you can put this down in your notes that you'll be able to talk about some of the different hypothesis theories if you're ever asked on an exam question. As my daughter says, I'm just saying that you might want to make sure you understand. It would look like this. Matthew is first. Mark is second. That means Luke would be in the middle. And that Mark made use of both Matthew and Luke. Now, the second hypothesis comes from a British scholar. It's very popular among British synoptic scholars. And that is this. Mark comes first. So now Mark has the priority. Luke is posterior, means Luke was last. But Luke made use of just Matthew. So it could look something like this. Mark is first, Luke is last. Mark was used by Matthew. Luke was used. Luke used Matthew, and so again, I'm just trying to illustrate the different gospels, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the first couple because I want to talk mainly about the last one. The third one was proposed by Augustine, and that Matthew is the priority. And so basically, this view, it says that the way that they are in the Bible, the canonical order, would be Matthew, Mark, Luke, that is the way that they were written. And, a lot of people may just believe that, hey, that's the way, that the order that they're in, that's the way that they were written, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so in that discussion, that Luke knew and used then both Matthew and Mark, and maybe a large amounts of independence as well as some dependence on others. And so the style of scribing would prohibit great use of different sources. They would use one at a time. It's not like they went to the CBCC library and they checked out a bunch of books and they could share them, or they went on the internet and they all found the same information. And so basically it would look like this. Matthew's first, Mark's second, Luke's last. Matthew, Mark used Matthew, and Luke used Matthew and Mark, and because they're in the order that they are in the gospel. Now, the fourth one is really just that they're independent of each other. While the gospel writers may have known each other in the same oral traditions because they heard the same stories, they received the same information, they did not use each other. And so Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all independent. They just heard the same stories and used them. Mark just having more in common with the other two. Now, the last one is what we're going to call the Marcan priority. It's sometimes also called the two source. I'm going to be calling it the Marcan priority. And so if you see that question asked, what is the Marcan priority? That is what we are talking about. And in that, the major premise is this. Mark was the first gospel written. Hence the reason Marcan, Mark was the first gospel. Matthew and Luke independently made use of Mark. So they didn't use each other, but they made use of Mark. And some also believe that Matthew and Luke may have used another source in common, which in synoptic discussion circles is called the letter Q. Now, I know I'm probably going to get an email or a question from somebody of why the letter Q. Well, here's the reason why the letter Q. I don't know. Maybe other letters were being used for something, and that's the one that they got to. Maybe, they decided, hey, Q is not very used a lot in words, so let's give it an opportunity to be famous for a while. I don't know. So, if we go with the Marcan priority, it would look like this. Mark comes first. Matthew and Luke make independent of each other. They use Mark while also using this independent source called Q, but they do not use each other. And so the major premise for Mark is this. One, Mark is a lot shorter. It is the shortest gospel. It's very brief. And so a lot of times in ancient writings, what we call antiquities, the shorter the document, as far as maybe within circles, the further back it is. Because of the nature of the writings and how long it took, the shorter the document, kind of the further back in time. But also that Mark's grammar is a lot rougher. If you're writing a paper for a class, you maybe sit down and just write a paper. And you get done, you read it, and it's like, oh, that grammar is terrible. And then you kind of begin to smooth it out. You maybe take it to the writing center. They kind of help you with that. And so Mark's grammar being shorter gives way to the fact that he was probably the first one out of the other three. Got stuck there for a second. There is a lack of what we call verbal and sequential agreements between Matthew and Luke against Mark. That is that maybe the order is different, or also the tense of the words that are being used is different from Matthew and Luke against Mark. And Mark's theology is very primitive. He, being the shorter, he just focuses on kind of telling a story. He doesn't kind of give any background, doesn't really explain a whole lot. Mark is he kind of hits the ground running. And we're going to talk a little bit about that when we get to the Gospel of Mark about why. But his theology and his explanation is very primitive. And so Matthew and Luke, being more in depth in that area, would have come later in the writing cycle. Now, I want to talk about the Q here. And again, I don't know why it's called the letter Q. That's just the letter they give it. And so in the Q hypothesis, because of the agreements of Matthew and Luke, there are agreements that happen with them that are not in Mark. And so the people say, okay, there's got to be something there of why Matthew and Luke agree with each other and where Mark doesn't. There are some supposedly different books out there, one being called the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Jude. There's other ones that are not in the canon, and most Protestant denominations do not recognize what we call the Apocrypha. And so they say, hey, there may be some similarities to other places, sources that were written by people claiming to be certain things, and maybe they weren't, and that's the reason they weren't included in the Gospel. And we talked about that under the canon. The sequence and context are often different, and also there are some sayings found in different gospels that are the same. And so one of the reasons for discussing the Synoptic Gospels is why they are there. Why do we have four Gospels? And understanding who was first. And so for me, in this class, I am postulating, and I go with the assumption that Mark is the first Gospel written. And then we have Matthew and Luke. Now, this is one of those areas in Christianity and religion in the New Testament study that if you email me or you come by and you talk to me and say, Mr. Couts, I hear what you're saying, but you know what? I really think they're just in the order the way that they are in the Bible. Matthew is first, then Mark, then Luke. You know what? That's great. I don't think it's something that we can disagree, but it is something that is not necessarily that important, or what I may say is not a hill that you need to die on which order that they came in. And so, but I want you to understand for the discussion of this class, we're going that Mark was first. But if you have questions about that, you want to talk to me about that, you can email me your thoughts. So some of the strengths about Mark being first is the credible reasons for the existence of Mark, and that it takes all the phenomena in the gospel seriously, and answers the questions of Luke, maybe how Luke maybe used Matthew, did he not use Matthew, who came first. But some of the weaknesses, it downplays or maybe underlines the early church who maybe had a different opinion. We really can't explain some of the minor agreements on it. And then really, as I just kind of talked about, it overstates many positions. And, for some people, there are theologians out there who this is all they do is talk about who came first. And we talked about 5 positions. I went through them kind of quickly. There are many more than 5. And so some people say, you know what? It's really not a big deal. The importance is that we have these 4 Gospels or these 3 Synoptic Gospels that are telling us the same stories and give us a different perspective. And that's the more important, is what perspective are the writers writing from. And so one of the things that we understand about the Gospels is the veracity, that it is multiple testimonies. If we were all witness to an accident or a crime, the police want to find out what we each saw. Maybe we all saw something just a little bit different. Maybe we all saw some of the things that were the same. But we have multiple ways of looking at it. Something as important as the Son of God coming into this world demands multiple witnesses. I believe that there was only one gospel account. The questions surrounding Christianity in the New Testament would be a lot greater than are out there right now. And what we call the doxology is talking about God's glory. And so all the Gospels really bring into the focus God's glory, and they represent that in a different manner. And the universality is that each Gospel is directed at a different group of people. When we start in the next lesson, we're going to begin to talk about the Gospels, and we're going to talk about who are they writing to. And so as you prepare to finish up this lesson and then go on to your next lesson, want to make sure that you understand that we are going to be looking at that. Make sure that you've got your notes filled in. Don't forget to complete any of the assignments that go with this lesson for this week or for this in this folder. And so if you have questions, please email me. If you have comments, please email me. and happy to talk to you about that at any time. I hope everybody has a great day or night, depending on when you are watching this video. Thank you.